Before I do, though, I'd like to share a little bit more of Bill Mastro's hobby history. Probstein mentioned that, they were surprised that 40 or 50 people hadn't really heard of him. They talked about his background a little bit, but I feel like we need to fill in some of the gaps from this conversation. And I'm not trying to drag him through the mud or anything like that, but I feel like it's necessary for the sake of context. Okay, so according to his sentencing memorandum, Mastro started collecting at a young age in order to, quote, escape the chaos of his abusive home, end quote. And over time, this turned into a major hobby for him, and he decided to pursue it full time. He traveled the country buying and selling, and this includes an oversized sheet-cut T206 Honus Wagner tobacco card that he bought from a New York card shop in the mid-'80s for $25,000. He then trimmed it and sold it shortly after for $110,000. And a lot of people suspected this card was trimmed for a long time. In fact, Mastro vehemently denied it for decades. And he finally fessed up to it in court in 2013. That itself was a big enough deal. There were articles written about that he finally fessed up. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but this card, I'm not just talking about the Wagner, this specific card has been on an incredible journey. This specific copy of the Wagner, I should say, has been on an incredible journey. It's like there's literally a book written about it. It's been owned by Wayne Gretzky. Oh yeah, it was also the very first card graded by PSA. Not as altered, right? It got a PSA 8, which we might have to come back to that later. Anyway, as Mastro continued to buy and sell some of these high-profile cards, he recognized the potential in auction houses. And he worked his way into that industry and then founded an auction house of his own called Mastro Auctions in 1996. And then the sentencing memorandum states that he launched his first online auction just 2 years later. Now, that's a pretty big deal because, 1998, the internet was not quite the behemoth that it is now. And even eBay was in its early years and it was really starting to get things going. So for him to have a higher profile auction house and to have it online, that was revolutionary. That was a big deal. And on this website, usually there were about 3 auctions per year. And according to the indictment PDF from justice.gov, it said, quote, bidders placed bids online through Mastro Auctions website or by directly communicating with a Mastro Auctions employee, typically by telephone. So these bids were either regular straight bids or ceiling bids, which Probstein referred to in their chat, and that's essentially the equivalent of a max bid on eBay. And some of you are probably very familiar with max bids. And now, even though all of the Wagner stuff went down in the 80s, the auction shenanigans supposedly didn't start until around 2001 or 2002. And a lot of what I'm going to paraphrase from going forward from here comes from the plea agreement PDF for former Mastro Auctions executive Doug Allen, who ended up serving a little over 3 years in prison himself. I like the way that they laid everything out in their recap. It also matches up quite a bit with the information offered up in an archived article that I saw about the two of them from FBI.gov. So it says that Mastro and his crew, quote, knowingly devised and intended to devise and participated in a scheme and artifice to defraud the customers of Mastro Auctions and to obtain money and property by means of materially false and fraudulent pretenses, representations, and promises, and by concealment of material facts. It also says that they, quote, engaged in practices designed to fraudulently inflate prices by bidders. They engaged in practices designed to protect the interest of consignors and sellers, which had the effect of artificially inflating the prices paid by some bidders. End quote. You see, at the auction house, they had access to see who had placed what ceiling bids or max bids, and that's kind of what Probstein referred to in the conversation. And then, now they didn't go into this part though, and then the auction house itself then placed bids to bump people up to their max bids. And at times, this resulted in the auction house accidentally winning an auction or a shill bidder winning an auction that they had no intentions of winning. And this is going to be a bit of a lengthy quote here, but I think it's information that's worth sharing. It says, quote, At times, Allen and Mastro ensured that when they placed a shill bid, and that shill bid was the highest bid at the end of the auction, that item would not be purchased by the shill bidder. Instead, Allen and Mastro sometimes canceled or caused the cancellation of the sale of the item. As a result, Allen and Mastro had an advantage over legitimate bidders because they knew that if their shill bid was the winning bid on an item, the sale would be canceled. This allowed defendant Allen and Mastro to bid in the auctions without risk and at the same time inflate the bid price, the seller's fees, and buyer's premium. Following the cancellation of a sale, defendant Allen instructed co-schemer A and other auction house employees to reconcile invoices and the shipment of items with canceled sales. End quote. Now, even though Mastro Auctions was sold to a private group in 2004, Mastro still worked for them and continued to be an active participant in this rampant fraud. Another major example was outlined in the Doug Allen plea agreement PDF that I've been reading from. It says, quote, beginning in late 2007 and continuing until at least late 2008, Mastro placed ceiling bids using shill accounts on several hundred items owned by historical collectibles, items that the auction house effectively already owned. Mastro placed ceiling bids on historical collectibles items to stimulate bidding on those items, to protect the auction house's investment in the items, and to ensure that the items were not sold for a perceived undesirable price. At the time those ceiling bids were placed, legitimate auction bidders would be unaware that it was Mastro and not other legitimate bidders who was bidding against them. Now, I should also add, in addition to all that, fraud didn't stop with shill bidding. In 2003, Mastro Auctions sold a batch of Elvis Presley's hair. Yeah, Elvis's hair. And the winners sent it off for DNA testing, and the results revealed that it came from 3 or 4 different people. So sellers asked for a refund and got it. And they got a little bit extra too, a little bit extra money too, but they had to keep quiet about the DNA testing. Why? Well, because the auction house then resold the hair. It didn't disclose that same DNA testing. Similarly, they sold a trophy ball that was supposed to be from the late 1800s. Those were like baseballs that were painted and, they had some significance. Well, the only problem was it was sent to a lab and it had paint on it that was from the post-World War II era. Remember, this was supposed to be from the late 1800s. Well, then they sold that ball again in 2006, and they left that info out. Whoops. Well, all of this stuff could only go on for so long before someone became suspicious or someone involved spilled the beans. And in 2006, their name was also, Mastro Auctions was also thrown in with a political scandal of some sort. Whether they were a part of it or not, they were thrown into it. So their name was getting out there in different capacities. And then in July of 2007, a New York Daily News article revealed that the Chicago division of the FBI was investigating Mastro Auctions for shill bidding. And in order to do so, they were reaching out to other hobby executives. And one of them in the article even noted that he gave them the name of a consignor who bid on his own items via Mastro Auctions. Now, at the time, Mastro executive Doug Allen, who I also mentioned earlier, he said he wasn't aware of the investigation. But by 2008, it really wasn't much of a secret anymore, and it definitely wasn't a secret come the National. Yes, the National, the convention, right? The one that we all talked about here recently. Well, in 2008, the FBI showed up and they handed out a number of subpoenas to a number of hobby executives. There was a funny line when I was going through articles from an unnamed source in the New York Daily News who said, I think they came to the National because they knew everybody would be here, all under one roof. It's like shooting ducks in a barrel. So over that next month, then, a grand jury brought a number of people in to testify. Things were definitely heating up. People were aware that something was going on. And keep in mind, this was around the same time as a major recession. So a lot of things were going on financially. And Mastro Auctions officially closed its doors amid that FBI investigation in March of 2009. Long story short, a lot of people owed a lot of people some money. and things get kind of messy, and some other familiar faces in the hobby make appearances. I don't want to bring all of them in right now because I want to focus mainly on Mastro and his history still. So, and that story, by the way, is far from over. So I'm going to keep going here. I'm not going to pretend that I'm any sort of legal expert, but I just want to provide a general timeline. So the grand jury put out their charges in February of 2011. There's an FBI article that talks about how Mastro and some of his former associates were indicted on fraud charges in July of 2012. Once those have been filed, this is finally becoming a legitimate criminal case. There was a trial in 2013, and this is where Mastro finally admitted to trimming the Wagner, like I mentioned earlier. And it looks like things bounced back and forth for a while, as they usually do in the legal system. I know at one point he paid a massive fine of $250,000. And then finally in August of 2015, he was sentenced to 20 months in prison. So he went to jail. And he started that sentence in late November and was eventually released a little early in May of 2017. So he didn't serve the whole 20 months, but he served most of it. He served 18 months. So there are a few quotes I want to read from that sentencing, though, coming from U.S. District Judge Ronald Guzman. And he didn't mince words when it came to the situation at hand and the subsequent consequences. He called the online marketplace the quote-unquote Wild West of commerce, and he said a sentence of probation would utterly fail to provide deterrence to other auctioneers and collectors. Now, he did acknowledge Mastro's charity work, which became a big part of the argument in lessening his time. And he said, well, at the same time, and I mean literally at the same time as that charity work, he has lied, he has cheated, and he has defrauded on a massive scale. The defendant presents two inherently different personalities. And finally, the judge added, unfortunately, we're not talking about a mistake. We're talking about persistent, intentional, sophisticated fraud, even in the face of warnings of others and the knowledge he was being investigated, he persisted. End quote.